about the last chapter of the book, which has a very interesting kind of origin. Yesterday, Mike Gannon talked about the meeting that was held in Gainesville in the summer of 1993, which collected a lot of the potential authors for the book, many of them at the University of Florida, but also from around the state, including myself and Gary Marmino, and David was there, George Pozzetta was there. And it was a big discussion about this book and how important it would be, the original edition of the New History of Florida. And a discussion about the different ways it could be divided up thematically, chronologically, what the kind of the subject matter would be, and who the authors might be. And as the meeting developed, some of us, including Gary and George and David, I think you were also there with this concern, and myself, that it seemed like most of the chapters dealt with the early history of Florida. Like maybe half of the chapters dealt with the period in Florida history before it even became a state, when there were not many people lived here. And for the modern period of Florida, when you had, by 1993, you had maybe close to 15 million people living in Florida, but there wasn't room for that in the book, we felt. Is that right?
Damn right.
So we had to make an argument that we needed more attention to what's going on in the 20th century, when Florida is growing and developing so fast and becoming a major state and experiencing immigration, economic development, becoming a major political player in the national scene, and so on. So we finally got an agreement from the group and from the press that we would add a couple of chapters. David's chapter on the political history of Florida, which is mostly contemporary or 20th century anyway, right? Your first chapter. And Gary had World War II. And then George and I were assigned to do the immigration chapter. And then there was this final chapter that Gary and I volunteered for. We didn't know what to call it, but it turned out to be something to do with the social history of modern Florida. We got a title later on. So that chapter almost never happened, except that we had to argue for it and make it happen. But then, that was the summer of '93. And our chapters were due sometime in early '94, and Gary and I were falling behind. I had finished my immigration chapter, and he had finished World War II chapter, but we were falling behind on the last chapter. We were busy with other projects. We weren't sure how to organize it. How do you organize a subject like the social history of modern Florida? It was a dilemma. And then Gary had this opportunity to go to the Huntington Library to spend the summer in research and writing out there. And I had some of my own deadlines and projects going on. And we said, maybe we can't do this project. After we had argued for it, maybe we don't have time to do it. Mike was sending us letters and calling, what's going on? We need your chapters. And finally we decided, okay, maybe we can do this. Gary said, maybe I could start working on this out at the Huntington. Spend a few hours every morning and work on it. And so we agreed that I would sort of write up an outline of what a chapter like this might look like, what kind of things would be included. And my thinking about it was shaped by a course I was teaching at Florida Atlantic on historiography, which is the study of the historical writing and interpretation. And it was mostly about American historians. But I've recently been adding historians from England and from France. Particularly, I was interested in the work of the Annales School of French historians and the writing of a historian, a very famous historian from France called Fernand Braudel. And he dealt with mega history. He wasn't interested in elections or wars or You know, that's just you know, a blip on the big scheme of history. He wants to know, he wants to write about, talk about, what are the larger forces that shape history? Climate, soil, food supply, disease, things of that sort. And he did that in a number of books. So in preparing this rough sort of outline, that was where I was coming from. So I have a letter here. I dug out my files, and I actually found some of this stuff. So I'm going to read some of these, including some of Gary's letters. So this is a letter that I wrote to Gary on June 6, 1994. Good talking with you last week. As I mentioned, I have had to cut back on my work for other reasons, but I've been thinking a lot about the Gannon chapter. My thinking focused first on the need to provide a strong interpretive framework for the chapter based on the dynamics of change in Florida since 1940 or 1945. By focusing on the forces for change, the essay would have some coherence and direction. And most of all, the stuff that should be included would somehow find its way in. And here are some of the big changes that might be covered, I wrote. So then I give a list, a kind of an outline list of the kind of things that might be covered. And I start with population and demographic change, urbanization, economic growth and development, change in agriculture, work and labor, women, tourism and retirement, consumerism, leisure, recreation. It's getting to be a long list by now, as you can see. Technology, including air conditioning, air travel, and other forms of transportation like highways. Race relations, civil rights, immigration, Latinization, multicultural society, social problems, crime, and weak public sector. That's always been a problem here in Florida. And finally, the imagery of Florida. Then I went on to say these are only a few ideas, and I'm sure that you have plenty of your own, since you have written a lot on these subjects. You might be able to find some ideas and things you've already written. And then I sent off my letter. And so Gary's out at the Huntington. He's got my letter, and he has a lot of free time to think about things and work on different things. And so he, about 6 weeks later, I get in the mail this big pack of a manuscript written on a yellow legal pad by hand. It's about 30 pages, which he apparently wrote. He said he worked a couple of hours. I'll read another letter from Gary here in a minute. Not having access to all of the notes he had, all of those clippings he had at home and on his desk in his office. And so, along with this sheet, Gary, you might want to look at this. The paperclip is even rusted out, sitting in my file cabinet. Raymond, finally, I've been trying to put a couple of hours each morning on this project. Huntington is simply one of the most beautiful places I've ever worked or studied at. They pamper the scholars. Subsidized lunches, I guess you like that part. The library is ringed with elaborately designed gardens. Some thoughts on the enclosed piece. Keep in mind that I was working without many notes. He meant without any notes. And then he has puts in quotation marks. Since when, you ask, has that ever bothered me? Also, as you note, I work in a high-tech field. I like the feel of yellow legal pads. And then he has on the back some thoughts. I decided to try to go back and incorporate some of the early history using 1845 as a starting point. I've also tried to avoid repetition, figuring that you already covered stuff on Latinization, and I covered World War II. I tended to ignore those phenomena. And he says, try and find a consistent pattern. I feel I was inconsistent in my use of numbers and the spelling of numbers. Those are the only inconsistencies he's thought about. When finished, simply send to Mike, who's desperate for anything. You need not send me a copy first. He wasn't even interested in what I would do to it. I'll be at the Huntington until August 13th and blah, blah, when I'm flying back and so on. And he says, my best with admiration and goat cheese from Lotus Land. Gary's a great letter writer. So, I had this yellow pad full of stuff. I got on my computer and I started typing it in, and along the way I was integrating a lot of stuff from I did have notes, which I used. I had lots of files. So I integrated it in virtually every paragraph, but it turned out that if you look at the original book chapter, and that was mostly still in the second edition here, he followed almost exactly the outline I laid out there in that letter. He just went from one subject to another, dreaming it up out of his head, actually. And then afterward, I sent it back to him. I sent him a copy, even though he didn't want one. I sent it. He said, the essay looks and reads very well. A bravuro performance. When I get a chance, I'll work on some minor revisions and additions, but we can sleep the sleep of angels, knowing that the book will be strengthened by this essay. So that's what it's like to work with Gary Mormino. It's a great pleasure, and it's very exciting, and you never know what's going to happen.
Questions from the audience? Please use the microphone. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to give you my own personal projection for the future of Florida. As a young boy, I moved from Philadelphia, South Philly, to Harlem, anybody knows Philly. And I went to California in 1957. Lived in the Bay Area. And we used to go hunting up in Napa before they discovered wine. We used to make better wine in New York State one time. Why I'm telling this now, that was California 1950s. I'm using a parallel, if I can, for a second. I was in California about 2 months ago. There's 35 million people in California right now. There's 35 million people in all of Canada. Just visualize that. My daughter built a new home in Palo Alto. She lives in a section where there's moors, and you go 2 blocks over, there's have moors. You leave Palo Alto, and you can go right to slums real fast. So California has reached the pinnacle of no return. It's just overwhelmed itself. Now, I bought a house here in Florida roughly 25 years ago in the St. Johns River, passing through. I never was in northern Florida my whole life. I used to fly down to Miami. I came up here to visit a Churchill relative in Jacksonville and discovered the St. Johns River. Wow, I couldn't believe something like that existed in the East Coast of America. 3 weeks later, we come back, we bought a house, we didn't even know what it looked like, my wife and I just wanted to come. A little bungalow, fell in love with Florida. I won't give you the long tale, but 13 years ago we moved downtown because St. Augustine was such a, I didn't know places that existed like St. Augustine. And yet, St. Johns County had what, roughly 75, 80,000 people 25 years ago? It's probably over 200,000 now, approaching that. What kills it all? Simple, overpopulation. Now you can take it any way you want. I know we all want that dream of more and more people coming because it makes us sound important and superior, but you reach a tipping point rather rapidly. And I think Florida is probably right at that cusp right now. You know, of course in 20, 25 years, we will be California. there'll be 35 million people here, and it won't be what it looks like now. And that's my thoughts on that.
I want to challenge the premise that I just heard a little bit ago. Why should Florida, in the time of globalization, have a character as a state? Admittedly, I come from a state that's schizophrenic. North, South, North and South Louisiana, very different places. But why should any state have a, quote, character, unquote? What do you mean by that? Or an identity that somehow sets it apart in an age when supposedly we're all citizens of the world now. I mean, maybe what Florida is doing is actually showing us, it's been suggested, showing us what the future really will be. And that question is not the right question to be asked at all.
No, that's an excellent question, and what does our future hold in a highly mobile society like ours? How do we define ourselves today by the life we live? And can we extract from that some sense of what it means to be a Floridian? I think not, quite frankly. And maybe the same is true of my home state where I grew up, Rhode Island. Well, I do think Rhode Islanders have a sense of who they are. They've got a sense of their past, the role of Roger Williams, etc. We in Florida have almost, this conference I think reveals, others like it do, that we in Florida have no sense of our rich Spanish past, the rich cultural traditions that intersected in Florida over the course of time, and how that defines us or shapes us today. So we're missing something there, but you're probably right. In a state where we've got the mobility that we see, where as many people move in as almost move out, and as many people come in for short stints, seniors come in for 6 months and a day to qualify for the tax breaks in Florida. But where's their identity? It's not in our state. Where's the identity of the immigrants who locate in Florida for freedom, for a place to educate their children, for a place to put their money where it'll be secure over time, but they keep going back home because there's family and other things that draw them. So I don't have the answer to your question other than it's incredibly complicated, and I think the future is one probably without a mythic identity that will unify us.
I wanted to cast the net a little bit wider on the thoughts of Florida today and some other states that are like it. We've mentioned several times here today that within the next few months, Florida will become the third most populous state, not the fourth most populous state. And that makes, in numerical order, California, Texas, and Florida together, which compose around 27 to 28% of the U.S. population in those three states. All of them are in the South. All of them are on some saltwater body, Pacific Ocean, Gulf, and the Gulf and the Atlantic for Florida. And all of them are, to go back to the beginning of this program, all are part of the Spanish Empire in their past. And I think as we look to this, perhaps out of those three at the moment, Texas has the most similar identity, but that just be maybe my misinformation on how Texas feels about itself. I don't know that we would say that California has a singular identity. And I think, that as we've talked here at the past few presentations, it's hard to have an identity when you feel like you're in transition, because your identity itself is in transition. And I think we need to look to those other states that are like us, that are composing such a huge portion of the nation's population right now, to see where the similarities are there and the similarities of the trends.
Someone had mentioned earlier, this is the third Spanish period. Think about it. If you wanted to coin a historic and, I suppose, ethnic, racial identity, it is extraordinary period we're witnessing, and much of it very recent.
I wanted to cast the net a little smaller. Since I don't have any idea what to do about Florida, I really have questions questions about my own little city of St. Augustine. Because since I've lived here 20 years, we went from a town that cared about history to a town that cares about pirates and ghost tours. And right and left, I mean, they're just ripping down historic buildings. And I think that the vision of who we are, even as St. Augustinians, really is in jeopardy. I mean, are we now just a big concert venue for people to come in, reap the, I'm not really sure what we're trying to become. I see the desperation of the economy. But again, why are we throwing away history? We still don't have any kind of viable civil rights museum. We don't have, any of the stuff that's really us. What we have are, like I said, sort of an amusement park of ghost tours and pirates. So do you have any theories of what we can do as St. Augustinians to try to have a better vision of maybe what's more sustainable? How can we grow up, as you said?
Mormino looks at me and says, please answer this one. I think St. Augustine is growing up. I wrote about it, the civil rights past, some 30 years ago. It does seem to me that St. Augustine has always been about making money. And that's been the prime driver. How do we make money out of this place and make it work for us? And other things got in the way over time. But I think today, it seems to me St. Augustine is trying to come to terms with its heritage, including its racial heritage. And it seems to me that the city, by the partnership it's established with the University of Florida and with Flagler, it's rebuilding the past so that it's more than about pirates and ghost stories. So I'm reasonably sanguine about St. Augustine and the direction it's headed. And I think if you asked me that 10 or 15 years ago, I wouldn't have said that.
Again, perspective. What other city in Florida, St. Augustine's what, 15,000 people today? What other city in Florida would turn out hundreds of people to listen to historians talking about St. Augustine and Florida history? If this conference had been held in Tampa, you would have had a few dozen people at most. So I must admit, I've always been overwhelmed by the sensitivity and interest of St. Augustinians in their history. I hate ghost tours. I don't know how to combat it, but boy, it seems to me you're doing a lot of things right here. And with a great deal to lose. I mean, here's a city where if it tripled in size, would be imperiled, I think. So, I mean, keep up the fight, but keep in mind, at least from my perspective, I'm pretty impressed with your appreciation of the past here.
Well, Gary actually started with what I had hoped to say, that being in St. Augustine for a long time, and I've been here working on and off for about 40 years, it's easy to see the things that you don't particularly enjoy that have developed, and it sometimes makes it harder to see the things that really have. The ghost tours and a lot of the more touristic approaches to history are really, I think, just a layer on top of the good things that have been preserved, why people still come to St. Augustine for history. And the fact that, as Gary said, we've had people here for the last 2 days on gorgeous days, and not just the academics, it's the people of St. Augustine, and at historical society events and research society events, they're always packed. And by comparison, in Gainesville, you would never get really a crowd of this size at these sorts of events. St. Augustine's the only place in the country with an archaeological ordinance that has some financial teeth to it. And so I think there is a lot that's sometimes hard to appreciate when you see the more visible parts of the development. So, well, thank you, Gary, for saying that too.
Florida is a microcosm of the United States. We don't have the winters, we don't have the ice, we don't have the mountains, but we pretty much have everything else in terms of the diversity of the people and their feelings, and certainly politically and culturally and many other things. But that's sort of, and I sort of feel that, especially if I travel to different parts of the states. Each part is very, very different. I mean, St. Augustine's different from Jacksonville. You've got the Hastings. It's a rural community. You go to Orlando and it's Disneyland and everything else down there. And you go to Miami and all of the culture. But you sort of see a lot of diversity within the state that you would find elsewhere in the United States, but it's kind of compact within our small state. The other thing I just wanted to mention, as someone who grew up in St. Augustine and returned 9 years ago, one of what could be a problem with trying to deal with the history and everything else, and I think it's been coming together more recently, is that you've got private ownership of things, you've got city ownership of things, state, federal, and now the University of Florida, thank goodness, has come in and is working to try and bring a lot of this together. But a number of years ago, my father and Senator Park's father went to Jamestown prior to the 400th anniversary to see what did they do and what can we do here. Well, the difference is Jamestown is a private foundation. St. Augustine was a lot of commercial interest, and that's a big, big difference. And I think that's probably why there's been so many difficulties really come to grips with St. Augustine. But it's great to know how much history is coming out and continues to come out about the city and about the state. Thank you.
Comment about Jamestown and everything else. Certainly that area, the historic Triangle of Virginia, is having that same problem with commercialization and everything else. I mean, you know, the main attraction used to be Colonial Williamsburg. You know, Colonial Williamsburg has been way overtaken by Water Country USA and outlet malls and Busch Gardens, the old country. And you know, they too are struggling. You know, that is an area that is, you know, completely dependent on historic tourism, and increasingly that historic tourism is taking back seat towards that other stuff. And they are, you know, so St. Augustine is not alone in dealing with those issues.
Dr. Colburn, when you had the first slide and you were going through a list of things, and you got to the point of diversity where you said something about Hispanics and white people and whether they were seniors and African American. And I thought you said something about that the policies were being focused more on the Hispanics than the African Americans. And but you didn't go into any detail. And I just tried to picture how a government would work its policies to affect or not affect people by their ethnicity as opposed to their economic circumstances. Could you say more about that?
Well, the big issue really came in the 60s when the Cubans began to migrate into the United States, fleeing Fidel Castro and the communist regime he imposed on Cuba. It was at the same time that the nation was coming to terms with its own racial past, and Florida was coming to terms with its. And Black Floridians were expecting that the state would begin to provide some sort of relief for what they had experienced in their past in the state of Florida. All of that was pushed aside as the nation and the state dealt with this huge flood of Cuban immigrants and refugees. And the federal government provided significant appropriation dollars to assist in the Cuban settlement, despite the fact that many of the Cubans who came were particularly well-off and well-educated and did quite well, thank you, even without the federal support, but they had the federal support to assist them. The African-American population in Florida got none of that. The other thing that caused great discontent in the Black community was that if you look at our society, we in all its permutations. With the exception of the African American community, we pass property and wealth along to one another. It gives our children, grandchildren, a real advantage in life. Black Americans and Black Floridians in particular have almost nothing to pass along to their children. And then to see the government interceding on behalf of Cubans and ignoring their plight was something that was particularly distressing. I could talk more about the Hispanic population support provided there, but I think you get the drift.
Let me just follow up on that because I had a personal experience with it when I was teaching at FAU. I had been writing about race relations in Miami. Is that still working?
That's good.
For some time, and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission came to Miami in somewhere in about 1992 or 3, and I got subpoenaed to testify, give my testimony to the commission about the state of race relations in Miami. Now, it wasn't bad to be subpoenaed. I was happy to go and serve my government, and I knew something about this subject. But, and I made a 5-page prepared statement about the state of race relations, which I didn't think were very good. There was just, although a number of other people said, oh, things are doing great here in Miami, everyone's getting along so well. And I said, well, you know what? It's not going to take very much to touch off another incident that will turn very nasty. And there was a couple of people on the panel who were from anti-immigrant groups, and they were making their case. And so I brought up this point David just made about the investment that the federal government made in Cuban Americans as the immigrants as they came from Cuba. Something like $3 billion were invested in various kinds of resettlement. They had multiple training programs at the University of Miami to retrain all the professionals, doctors, engineers, dentists, lawyers, get them retrained and certified to practice their professions in the U.S. They had other educational programs, they had employment programs, housing programs, the whole works. And in response to that guy who was defending that, and I should point out that the black community turned out in big numbers for this event. They were sitting in a room like this, and the commission was up on a dais, and I was facing them. And I said, if the federal government had put $3 billion into the Miami black community, things would look a lot different. Big cheer, whatever. So I felt pretty good about that.
I just want to say, I'm Margot Pope, and I've been a journalist for 42 years, retiring last year. And this year, the city of St. Augustine is launching a vision process. I think this conference is perfectly timed to the city's visioning process that's going to begin. They had an introductory meeting last week. You can go on staugustine.com and read about it. That's a plug for my former newspaper. But the important thing about it is that it will bring people together, and it's a public visioning process. And already people are kind of concerned, well, too much is going to be in the sunshine, government in the sunshine. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity for the kinds of comments that were made about where are we going, and I'm an optimist. I believe that when we have these kinds of structured programs, things do happen. I was on the trip in '93 to Charleston that began the visioning process back then. My mother was on the trip that Nell referenced to Williamsburg and Jamestown in the 1950s to help launch the 400th and what do we want to be. So I think all these things we've heard today are the kind of things that you should be at those meetings, because I'm going to be there, and I'm not necessarily going to be writing about it, I'm going to be talking about it. Thank you.
My name is Consuelo Lippi, and we were talking about definitions. And I would like to mention my father's definition about St. Augustine. He used to travel quite often to this beautiful city, but now he is 100 years old and he cannot travel anymore. But he used to say, St. Augustine is historic during the day and romantic at night. And we as citizens of this beautiful city, no matter how many changes we have, we should maintain our city historic during the day and romantic at night. Thank you.
Seems like a perfect ending for a really nice conference. Before you leave, I'd like to reiterate the thanks to Flagler College for hosting this, to the Florida Humanities Council, and a plug for them. If you guys are not a member of the Florida Humanities Council, I'm giving extra credit to for my class. Please go on their website. Please join them. These are tough times for the humanities, and the projects and the things they do in local communities are unbelievably fantastic. And also to Susan Parker and the St. Augustine Historical Society, thank you so much.
Thank all of you for being here. It's really gratifying to put a lot of work into an event like this and have as many people turn out as they have. And I think probably the one thing that was said to me today that made all the work worthwhile came from Shirley Thompson when she said, "I'm so sorry this is going to be over."
Thank you.